Happy month of May, folks, and welcome to episode 544 of #AskGSM here today for Wednesday, May 1st, 2024. I'm Graham GSM Matthews. Hope you guys are doing well and having a great week so far. If you want to send in a question to the show, you can do so by tweeting me on the Twitter machine at WrestleRant with the #AskGSM. Find me on Facebook as well, facebook.com/Graham.GSM.Matthews. Drop a comment on the post I usually put up on Tuesday nights, if not on the wall itself. And last but certainly not least, drop your question down below in the comment section on this very video. I'll include your question in next week's edition. So let's get right into it. We got 3 full pages worth of questions here today, so let's not waste any time. Jordan B. from YouTube, their question was, I believe back in 2008, there were plans to have William Regal win the World Heavyweight Championship from CM Punk after his King of the Ring victory before the failed drug test. My question is, how long do you think William Regal's world title reign would have been? Great question, and a question that is interesting, the interesting timing of it. Obviously, I've made it well known, well documented here on the show and other places in the last 16 years, was that it was that storyline actually that got me into wrestling full time. I had dabbled in and out of wrestling for a little while prior to that point. I don't know if I would have consistently watched wrestling had it not been for the William Regal Raw GM King of the Ring thing in April of 2008. I started watching the week before he won King of the Ring, was fascinated by the fact that he was wrestling and an authority figure on the show, tuned into the King of the Ring show, don't remember anything else about the episode watching it live. I mean, I remember now, but watching it live, I don't really remember much, aside from the fact he won the King of the Ring, and that was like a big deal. So that was really what got me into wrestling. Now, I know that wasn't your question, but the reason I bring that up is that I'm kind of fascinated about that time period, because I agree, I had also heard and read certain things at the time, and in retrospect, that Regal was kind of believed to have gone on to win a world championship had he not gotten suspended for the failed drug test in the spring of 2008. The interesting timing around your question is the fact that I had just listened to an excerpt, actually, from the short-lived podcast that Regal was doing back in 2022, right after he joined AEW. He did a podcast with Matt Kuhn, I believe his name is, the Gentleman Podcast, the Gentle Villain, or whatever the name of the podcast was. I wasn't listening to the show at the time, and I don't know if they did an entire episode on that. I think someone had just sent in a question. And the excerpt is on YouTube. Now, I was going down the rabbit hole of William Regal clips right after he returned to WWE TV a couple of months ago. And he had talked about in the clip that he had no clue if there were plans to have him win a world championship, because he's never really talked about this in depth before now. I think people have referred to it or he's referenced it. And he even mentioned in that final promo that he cut before his not final promo, but the promo he cut before his final match, with, I almost said Claudio Castagnoli, at the time Antonio Cesaro in December of 2013 on NXT. He goes, yeah, I would have been a top star had I not flushed it down the toilet type of thing. And it kind of sounds like that he could and would and should have been a world champion had he not gotten in his own way. Now, a couple things on that. You can go out of your way to listen to the clip yourself if you want the full details from his perspective. But he had mentioned that he actually wasn't really doing anything at that point. The reason he had gotten busted, and that was the second one, because prior to that he had been busted a few months or a few years earlier. The first suspension may have come in the fall of 2007. That was during like the drug pharmacy scandal thing that WWE was involved in. Some superstars, including Kennedy, Regal, Chavo, and a number of others as well around that time period. I think Regal was caught up in that, and obviously had a lot of other issues well prior to that point in the early 2000s and mid-2000s and shit. But the 2008 suspension had nothing to do with any of that, I guess. He had mentioned that he was taking stuff, I think, for his heart, because he had a whole heart issue when he was over in India, almost died from that. He's almost died a couple different times, actually. And he was taking stuff for his heart around that point, and I think that was what kind of set off the suspension. And even WWE had told him, like, we know you're clean or whatever. We don't even really know, because I guess they couldn't tell him what had caused the suspension or what had caused the test to come back positive or whatever, until he found out after the fact, because he didn't really know if it was the stuff that he was taking for other reasons that WWE knew about. And it wasn't really anything that was his fault. It was more of just a circumstance sort of thing, where I guess if they repealed it, it would have been a bad look for the company or something along those lines. Again, he talks about it in more detail in that clip on YouTube. Could he be lying? And even said in the clip, I have no reason to lie about this in retrospect. He's pretty open and honest about his past issues and what he was guilty of, what he wasn't guilty of, and that was one thing that he wasn't really guilty of, that he was perceived to have been guilty about, or guilty of, rather. But they had to kind of follow protocol. He was suspended for 60 days. That was his second one, so it was 60 instead of 30 when he came back. He wasn't GM anymore. They finished up that storyline before he got written off TV. It happened pretty abruptly in May of 2008, and he came back. He did win the Intercontinental Championship a couple months later, but he didn't have that same steam from earlier on in the year when he was the Raw GM and had all that heat and all that other sort of stuff. And he even mentioned, honestly, in the clip, which was fascinating as well, that getting suspended was one of the better things to have happened to him, because he kind of became a character actor is the best way to describe it, where method actor, where you kind of become the character that you are, and he kind of saw himself mentally and maybe even emotionally going down a dark place, going down a dark path when he was doing that evil Raw GM character in King of the Ring back in the spring of 2008. So I thought that whole thing was really fascinating. All of this to say, for a bigger point, I don't think there were any actual plans put in place for him to win a world championship. You said King of the Ring, or I'm sorry, he did win King of the Ring. You said from CM Punk didn't win the World Heavyweight Championship until June. Regal got suspended in mid-May of 2008. Punk was still Money in the Bank. Maybe they knew at that point that Punk would go to Raw and then win the World Heavyweight Championship from Edge. They don't even really, even today, but especially back then, they did not think that far out. I think they wanted the WWE Championship on SmackDown with Triple H. They probably knew that was staying on him for a while. I don't see him beating Triple H for that championship. I know Regal and Triple H were doing some stuff earlier on in 2008. I don't think he would have beaten Triple H for that belt. I think Triple H was always earmarked to go to SmackDown because they were really trying to hype up the big debut of SmackDown on My Network TV 9 or whatever the fuck it was. The CW maybe? I don't remember. Back in late 2008. So I don't think he was going to beat Triple H. He probably would have won the World Heavyweight Championship had the storyline continued through the summer. I don't think they knew for a fact that he would have won it from Punk specifically. I think they saw, the World Heavyweight title and the WWE title through the draft, that again, they probably don't even really figure out until right beforehand, are both going to SmackDown. We need to find a way to get the World Heavyweight Championship on Raw. So they had Punk cash in, bring the belt to Raw, and you could tell Punk was never meant to be a long-term champion, probably never even champion in the first place, because the win was great. I still love that Money in the Bank cash in from June of 2008, still one of my fondest memories as a fan. But he wasn't booked all that strong. He lost a fair amount of matches, was never the focal point on Monday nights. He probably would have beaten Punk, but I don't think that was ever the plan to definitively have him beat Punk. If in an alternate universe, if Regal does not get suspended, okay, and Punk does win the World Heavyweight Championship, I think that would have been the perfect SummerSlam match. Punk and JBL, who gives a shit? The match kind of came out of nowhere. No one really cared anyway. It wasn't the focal point. They had Cena and Batista at that point on Raw. That was a bigger match. Even Jericho and Shawn Michaels was a bigger feud, far more so than Punk and JBL at that point. Punk and JBL was like third down the card on the Raw side of things, not even counting the SmackDown matches. So that was another thing as well, because SmackDown also, Triple H and Great Khali, who gives a fuck, but, they had Edge and Undertaker. That was a pretty stacked SummerSlam. I would say Regal could have, maybe at Great American Bash or at SummerSlam, have beaten Punk for that championship. How long would he have held it? Back then, World Championship runs, Triple H having held the WWE Championship that year for like 7 months was an anomaly. Like, that was surprising because back then, prior to that point, aside from John Cena, I guess, and even after that, people did not hold championships, let alone World Championships, for very long. Typically, they were only a couple of months. He probably only would be champion through, the end of the year, maybe, November, December. Regal would not have walked into WrestleMania as the World Heavyweight Champion. He probably would have been one of those guys that held the championship briefly before losing it to a Shawn Michaels or back to Punk or John Cena, most likely, and then slid right back down the card when he wasn't the GM anymore and he wasn't the top heel on the show. It probably would have been short-lived, unfortunately, but it would have been better than him not winning a championship at all, in my opinion. So to make your short question very long, I think he would have been champion for a couple of months. In an alternate universe, if he were to win the championship, even though that was never, I don't think ever really truly set in stone, because no one that has ever worked for that company that no longer works there now, like creative writers and stuff, and even Regal himself, has never said 16 years later that it was meant to happen, that Regal would have won the world championship. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't think that was ever actually guaranteed to happen. But if it did, it probably would not have lasted long. He probably would have been a transitional champion before Cena won it later on in 2008 or early 2009. Hand sanitizer, 1963. Their first question was, is there a gimmick you thought of and have always wanted to see in a wrestler that do that gimmick that hasn't been done before? Could be anything, personality, attire, moveset, for example. I always thought about a wrestler having a finisher where he could copy the opponent's finishing maneuver, also wear a small piece of the opponent's attire. I used to think it would be cool before, not so much now, but still, does anything come to mind? A couple things come to mind. Two things primarily. I'm not saying they're good. They're pretty fucking bad. I don't have any good ideas. If I were to ever work for a wrestling promotion in any capacity, I should not be in charge of coming up with characters, because I would be fucking terrible at that. But I'll tell you two things. When my brother and I used to have like an E-Fed, wrestling promotion, fantasy wrestling promotion, whatever, soon after we started watching wrestling in 2008, we kept that going in some capacity, not officially. Like, I'm not even talking about like, oh, it was backyard wrestling. We wouldn't even do that. Like, we would do this on the couch in our living room and then come up with like cards. A lot of it was just in my head. It was as much of a WWE Hall of Fame was legitimate or is legitimate. I'm not comparing it to the Hall of Fame, but in the sense that there was no actual physical Hall of Fame, there was no physical wrestling promotion. A lot of it was just on paper and in my head, in his head too, to a certain extent. So we kept that going for 3 years maximum, but it was really like a year, and then we moved and we couldn't really do it anymore. It was really like 2 years max, year and a half. But two of the characters I thought that were some of my better ideas, and they weren't. They were terrible. And the roster of the wrestlers that we had or would portray on our shows, and we would portray every character that we had on our roster, mostly me and then him to an extent. He would primarily just be himself. But one of them was, a little bit later on in the existence of this E-Fed, Ricky Status. Now, this was before like the social media really stopped. The social media stuff really blew up. But like this was around the time that Twitter really first got going in 2009, 2010. I always thought it would be a cool gimmick that the guy would be named Ricky Status, kind of modeled in the same way of Robbie E from TNA, now Robert Stone actually in WWE, in NXT. And his finisher would be called the Trending Topic. I just thought the name Trending Topic would be a great finisher name because he would like to have the alliteration. It just sounds cool. It's the Trending Topic. Like, it sounds stupid as fuck. There's no other like aspect of the character that would really make sense, but I kind of felt like it was Robbie E meets Zack Ryder back in 2009, 2010, 2011. And even Zack Ryder has, mentioned that Robbie E was like a ripoff of Zack Ryder in WWE at that point, what he was doing in TNA. I thought that was clever, even though it's not. Even worse than that, and I've mentioned this before, I'm sure I've shared this story before here on Hashtag, but I was an avid reader from late 2008 up until it ceased publication in 2014 of the WWE magazine. Had every issue from late 2008 to when it closed down in late 2014. I had the very last issue, and I kept all of them too. And I've shared a picture of it before on my Facebook page, and I definitely have the issue still in my closet or something, of an issue that I wrote into, I think in late 2009, early 2010. It was when they were doing fan mail, and you can send in questions via email, and Facebook wasn't even really a thing at this point. You can send in a question via like fucking AIM. That's how far back we're going here. And I sent in a question about like what they would think of this character. Now, we were already doing this character in our fantasy wrestling promotion in the late 2000s, but I submitted it to WWE Magazine. So it is WWE Magazine canon to a certain extent, which is funny. I came up with the character of Jack Frost. I mean, it's Jack Frost. I didn't come up with Jack Frost, but as a wrestler though, where again, it was more so in theory and not really the, it was more so the idea of it, and it wasn't a fully fleshed out character at all. I'm only like good for the names of finishers, and that's really about it. So the guy would be called Jack Frost, kind of in the same vein, modeled after the, what's his name? God, not Dana Carvey. I almost said Dana White. The guy that portrays Jack Frost, Dana, or Martin, not Scorsese, Martin Short, right? Martin Short. He portrays Jack Frost in the third Santa Claus movie from 2007. That was kind of what he would look like, because I always thought that version of Jack Frost was cool, like the evil villain Jack Frost. And his finisher would be a neck breaker, and it would be called Frostbite. I always thought that would be a badass finisher name. So I wrote that into WWE Magazine. I forgot exactly what they said again. It's somewhere on my Facebook page, Graham GSM Matthews, cheap plug, from like many years ago, probably 10 plus years ago. I'd really have to go out of my way to find it. And I had the issue of the magazine still sitting in my closet. What issue it is, I don't know. I'd have to go through them. But I wrote into WWE Magazine, and they wrote back to me saying, I think they said they liked the idea. I'm shocked that Vince never stole it, because it is so fucking stupid that you could see a character like that on ECW at that point, or what eventually became NXT, or on the main roster. I would not have been shocked. I would not have been shocked at all. But it never made its way to WWE TV. If someone steals this, I'm going to sue you, even though I don't have it copyrighted. I'm sure Jack Frost itself is copyrighted, but I always thought that would be a cool idea. A Jack Frost, and maybe it's not even like a Jack Frost, like where he blows ice, like nothing stupid like that. But maybe his name is just Frost. Like, I don't know if it's Stone Cold Steve Austin type stuff. Like, instead of the Stunner, Frostbite would have been a pretty cool name for like a Stone Cold finisher. He could still hit the Stunner, but it could be called the Frostbite. Like, instead of just the Stunner. I feel like that would have been a cool name, but that's just me. Spending way too much time on some of these questions. We got to get going here. His second question was, with Maven blowing up with amazing content, will you try to have him on for an interview? And what would be 2 questions you 100% would ask him, knowing how open he is about discussing any topic? I don't know. I didn't grow up watching Maven. He does do amazing content. He has been interviewed a few times, at least once. I know he talked to Chris Van Vliet, who, no one does it better than he does for the most part. So I'm not even really sure what I would ask him that he didn't. I'd have to watch that interview and make sure I didn't ask repeat questions. I don't know. It would probably be more about his content stuff than compared to like his career. Like, I'm sure he gets asked about his theme song all the time. And he does indie stuff right now too, which is cool. I see him make the occasional indie spot every now and again. It would probably be about his content and knowing, like, one question I think I would ask him, do you fear of ever running out of topics? Because he's done a lot of videos and talked a lot about, like, oh, how much money I made at this point. This is the nicest, these are the nicest, and the meanest wrestlers I worked with. Like, those are, like, basic videos, but they do really well because he produces them well and stuff like that. But those are pretty basic topics. When he runs out of those ideas, what more does he really have in the can that he hasn't done yet? Has he already reached that point? I don't know if he would answer it honestly, but it would probably be about his content, just from a content creator standpoint myself, but also from the standpoint of someone that's really blown up, like you said, a career resurgence in a different way than we were probably expecting. For a guy that I thought wanted nothing to do with wrestling about 10, 15 years ago, is really kind of blown up again in wrestling in a different way. So it would probably be about that. As far as having him on for an interview, I mean, the opportunity would have to present itself. I'm not even really sure how I would go about doing it. Because a lot of the people that I talk to, that you could probably tell from the stuff that goes up here on the channel, is through the companies, or they have something to promote, whether it be a wrestler or an athlete or an actor or whatever. Pretty much everyone that I talk to has something to promote. I don't know what he has to promote aside from his channel. He doesn't need promotion from me. And I would love to talk to him, even if the opportunity did present itself. I would totally jump on it. I would figure out the questions later, but I would totally love to interview Maven. He seems like a swell guy. Brandon A. from YouTube, his first question was, he says, what's up, GSM? Hope all is well. Do you think the hate for the draft this past week was overblown? I agree with a lot of people that the shows weren't great, but I personally think the drafts were just fine. You can't do a total shake-up of the shows without each brand losing their identities and completely overhauling all of the stories they are telling. Besides that, it's just a false statement objectively to say nothing has changed, because, yeah, you're absolutely right. Raw got 3 new factions, which alone add up to 15 new people to the show. They got 15. They got big-time call-ups from NXT and 2 steals for big-time up-and-coming acts. Okay, you didn't put the fucking hyphens in there, so it was confusing. big-time up-and-coming acts come off or in the New Catch Republic and Braun Breaker. Okay, I'm all over the place with your question here. Also, a returning Braun Strowman, who will probably come off as more fresh than he has been. Not to mention how much they improved their women's division. SmackDown definitely got the short end of the stick. Carmelo Hayes is definitely a good pickup, but the bottom of their singles mid-card looks bad. With guys like Shinsuke, Corbin, hey, I like Corbin, Vinci, Andrade, and Apollo Crews, they come up much shorter than the stacked men's pool on Raw. However, someone from this group is going to have to be successful by default. I still remember how good Vinci was during the Cruiserweight Classic, even though that was 8 years ago. If he can go back to doing that as a heavyweight singles guy, he has potential to become compelling. In the women, they did get all at least have something going on right now. Every woman in that division gets TV time close to every week and can have a path towards getting over, even if they aren't at that level yet. Plus, A-Town Down, DIY, Pretty Deadly, Street Profits, Legato, Orton and KO, different bloodline combinations, and possibly even a revamped OC can make for a decent tag division. I think the biggest thing you can blame WWE for was the shows themselves being boring, but not the actual draft. Agree or disagree? I largely agree. I know we're going to get a lot of questions about the draft. I'll kind of discuss it here. I'm not going to sit here and say to you or to anyone really how to feel about the draft. I love the draft because I'm a fucking mark, and mostly because I grew up on the draft. I mentioned earlier how I started watching WWE in 2008, in April of 2008 specifically. The draft was one of the first major shows. It's like me being partial to King of the Ring, because that was like the first major Raw I had tuned into and was a fan for. Same thing with the draft. I love the idea of the draft and people switching shows. That was early on in my fandom. They did it in 2009, 2010, 2011. I love the draft. They moved away from it, brought it back. I love the concept. Far more than the stupid like Superstar Shakeup, which was basically the draft, but in a very lazy way. They did have a lot of people switch shows, more so on night one, or more so on night two than night one. And the thing is, like you said, the people that did stay put, makes sense to stay where they are. I think the biggest issue people have with the draft idea, the concept, and the execution of this year was that they make a big deal about people staying put, and I would too, like McIntyre or Punk should stay put on Raw. It's a big deal to keep those talents. But like I even got a text from someone that doesn't really watch, I mean, they're not hardcore fans, let's put it that way. And they texted me, I don't know if they enjoyed the overall concept of it, I'm not really sure, but they texted me and said they should really stay where they were previously. And they probably don't do that because they want to make it seem like a big deal that Raw got Punk, and it's not as big of a deal when they say Punk's staying on Raw, this person's staying on SmackDown, and then a majority of the rosters are staying where they are, so it's really not all that big of a deal. The champions being exempt I thought was a great rule. They did a bit better with the execution this year. They really should have the GMs more involved. I know they're not real authority figures, but if they really want to make this feel like a legitimate draft, they should have them more involved. I think just taking a different approach than having them out there naming the draft picks would be better. I like it personally, but a lot of the people don't. Sitting in the arenas, the shows are boring. I thought SmackDown was a good show on Friday. Raw was definitely fucking boring on Monday, I thought, overall. Not even a good go-home show for Backlash on Saturday. They just need to tweak the execution a little bit, even if it means not doing a formal draft and just orchestrating trades between the two GMs right after WrestleMania. I know they do the draft to boost numbers and viewership, and it's a special show, and people look forward to it and stuff. I don't think the ratings for the draft have ever been that big to justify them keeping the concept as a regular thing every single year. Doing it after Mania is key, as opposed to fucking October or November or September. That was always dumb. Doing it when they do in April does make sense right after WrestleMania. But there's still a lot of stories they haven't done yet, and still a lot of stories that are going on coming out of WrestleMania to where people cannot switch shows right now. Maybe in a couple months. So I know GM mode in the new 2K24 game, because I've been playing it, so I know. They do trades after every pay-per-view. You have the option to trade after every pay-per-view. I don't like that necessarily. I mean, in the game, whatever, but like in real life, that's just way too frequently. They don't have to have a set time for it, but I would be fine if they did trades or whatever, new acquisitions, quarterly. Like SmackDown in the last couple of months alone has picked up Braun Breaker just went to Raw, but they picked up Breaker, Tiffany, Jade, Naomi, Tyler Bate, among other people, Randy Orton, right after Survivor Series. They don't even really need a draft. The roster that they had, they didn't even really need a draft. And people say, oh, they should just do it for the NXT call-ups. Yeah, I mean, I guess, but if they do it just for the NXT call-ups, it would not take the form. You can't completely deplete the NXT roster. You're just calling up like 6 to 7 people. I know they called up like fucking 15 people last year, which was ridiculous. They gutted NXT. They gutted NXT again this year. That was expected, though. They still have some stars left over. Not a lot, but we'll get into that later. If you want to just do the NXT call-ups as part of the draft and no one else, maybe some trades, you got to go about it with a different format. You're not dedicating an entire 2 or 3 hour show to just NXT call-ups. At that point, you're picking the entire roster. That just doesn't make sense. It's different than the NFL draft, because in the NFL draft, people aren't, I'm not going to trade a Chiefs player for a Cowboys player in the draft. That's not how that draft works. I always thought it did. That doesn't make sense. They're drafting people from college in, the lower level league, and I know nothing about football. I know I pretend I do sometimes jokingly. I actually don't. If you couldn't already tell, it's pretty obvious. But that's what the NFL draft is, the NBA draft is, MLB draft, whatever. They're picking up younger talent to add to their teams. That's kind of like what the WWE draft does with NXT, but they're also doing brand moves too. And the current format listen, I love the whole brand battling for brand picks. It made no fucking sense. It was stupid. Because usually Raw would get stacked picks, SmackDown would get nothing. And it legitimately just doesn't even make sense, because then you would have to even out, Raw would have to win this many matches, SmackDown would have to win this many matches, and then how would NXT picks work? The winner of this Battle Royal gets 2 NXT picks? Again, it should be more even than not. So, I don't know. I don't even really like bringing back that idea. I saw people saying that. We're at that point with the draft where people are now saying, bring back the battle for brand picks. Is it more exciting? Sure, but it's fucking nonsensical. Even some of the stuff they do now, like when they have the war rooms, who the fuck are these people? All this in Pierce I get, but why does Bubba Ray Dudley give a shit about who SmackDown gets from NXT? That part just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But they need to figure out the draft. I like the draft. I agree. A lot of the moves that were made, I was a fan of. I talked about them more in depth on my website, Night 1 and Night 2 separately. Check them out. More thoughts on the draft coming tomorrow and each pick and whatnot on WrestleRant Radio on Thursday. But, I think it's just the execution of the draft that people have a problem with, which I understand. Doing trades instead would probably make more sense. But if they keep the draft, I'm not going to complain too much, because I like the draft myself, even if it's not always perfect. I mean, the order of picks is also questionable too. Picking fucking Nia Jax or Ricochet before the Bloodline or LA Knight, AJ Styles, the number 1 contender to the WWE Championship. What are we fucking doing here? That makes no sense. So, it's just stuff they need to continue to improve upon, and maybe not devoting an entire show to it, but maybe, as someone else asked a little bit later on, doing a separate show on the network, or I guess not on the network now, but on Peacock or on YouTube. That might make some more sense. And then recapping who got drafted on Raw and SmackDown as opposed to doing it on Raw and SmackDown. Next question also from Brandon. He says, a lot of talk for how bad Def Rebel songs are. Can you name 2 of your favorites, though, and also 2 of your favorite CFO songs and your 2 favorite Jim Johnston songs? Good question. Def Rebel, yeah, largely their music is generic shit, but it's not like they don't have some bangers. They do have some really, really good ones. Roman being number 1. Easily Romans. I can't come up with 2 definitive favorites for all of the artists. I'm just kind of going off the top of my head. I mean, Roman's easily, that's the only one I could really say for a fact that's one of my favorites. For Jim Johnston, Regals as well, Regality, also one of my favorites. Maybe Jericho's is the second one for Johnston's. You could say Stone Cold or Rock. I mean, those theme songs are amazing. I wasn't really around for those, though, when I started watching wrestling. Jericho and Regal were 2 of my favorites, and I love their themes, so I'll say them. For Def Rebel, I'm going to say Roman. Io Sky's theme is great. What was another recent one? There was I'm trying to think of the current roster. In the theme songs they have now, LA Knight, probably. LA Knights and Roman Reigns, I would probably say, are the 2 best Def Rebel themes, my 2 favorite anyway. And then two favorite CFOs. CFO had way better themes on the whole. Not all of them were great, but a lot of them were better. Like even Akira Tozawa had a fucking banger of a theme. It was a knockoff of Kill Bill, I think, but it's still a great... It was. I mean, they got rid of it and he has a new song now and it sucks. But the original song was great. Probably my two favorite... Again, there's so many to name. I know Shinsuke Nakamura would be an obvious one. Probably either... I would say AJ Styles and maybe Bobby Roode. AJ Styles immediately clicked. That's always been a great theme. He obviously just recently changed it because he went heel, whatever. Bobby Roode's was always a banger, so probably Bobby Roode, glorious, and AJ's phenomenal. I always really liked Austin Aries' theme. Samoa Joe's is another great one. I think I like his AEW theme more now, and I've said that before, but I also loved his WWE song. There's a lot of CFO songs, but those are some of the top ones. And then I also mentioned the Jim Johnston once a second ago. His last question. I heard someone say this week that WrestleMania 40 was Endgame and WrestleMania 39 is Infinity War. If so, does that make Iron Man, the movie, Survivor Series 2012? If not, what would be the right comparison for Iron Man? Do you even agree at all with the analogy in the first place? Thanks. I agree with the analogy that Infinity War was Mania 39 and Mania 40 was Endgame. In terms of the main events, like the events themselves is not true. So if you're going off of the events of like what happened with certain people, then those analogies work. I think an even better analogy that someone had posed on WrestleMania or on Twitter right after WrestleMania was that Mania 38 was A New Hope with Cody Rhodes returning, which makes perfect sense. Empire Strikes Back, and then Mania 40 being, I almost said Revenge of the Sith. I guess that would be his AEW run, right? That would be Return of the Jedi. So I love that comparison a lot more, personally. But the Infinity War and Endgame one are also perfect comparisons. They also came out 5 years apart. The whole Portals thing kind of happened in Roman and Cody this year. So that's definitely an apt comparison. You can't really compare anything else, though. Let's not get overboard. Let's not go overboard and get crazy with like the MCU comparisons. Survivor Series 2012 is Iron Man in what way? Because The Shield debuted? What other comparisons can you even really make? What would be the first Avengers movie? Them winning a TLC? Like, I don't even know what other comparison you would make. I'm all for like, MCU takeover comparisons, but like with the main roster and storylines with Roman and Seth, I mean, the Roman and Seth story has been going on for over a dozen years. I guess the MCU has as well, but it's not about just one character. If you want to make Roman Reigns Iron Man, Roman Reigns turned heel. Iron Man didn't go heel. Like, that just doesn't make sense. So, no, I would not say Iron Man is Survivor Series 2012. That show was not great. Iron Man was a much better movie than Survivor Series 2012 was. I know what you're talking about in the sense like, oh, they debuted and so did Iron Man. That's it. That's the only comparison. That is literally it. Because I don't know what you would make for like the first Avengers or Age of Ultron or Iron Man 2 and 3. I don't even really know what those would be. So, no. The only comparisons that really work are 39 and 40 as Infinity War and Endgame, respectively. Mikey Does It from YouTube. His question was, with the WWE draft being lackluster this year, do you think it would be better for WWE to make it its own standalone event, not having it be a part of Raw or SmackDown, but just streaming it on the WWE network with the GMs going back and forth on their picks? Yes, that would certainly be better. I just said that before in the other question, which is, I kind of answered your question there, but yeah, that might, I mean, listen, I enjoyed them as part of Raw and SmackDown, but the overwhelming majority of people, it seems like, do not like that and find the shows boring. No, nothing changed. I mean, open your fucking eyes. Clearly shit changed. Probably not at the top of the card, but I mean, listen, if they had switched McIntyre to SmackDown and separated him from Punk, people would have complained. If they put Rollins on SmackDown before he could feud with Punk, people would have complained. If they separated Sheamus from the Intercontinental Championship, people would have complained. If they put LA Knight on Raw away from the United States Championship, people would have complained. So just shut the fuck up, because a lot of these picks make sense. It's not exciting, okay, but what the fuck did you expect? But it's also a case of, someone else asked this question, like about people getting their hopes up. Who has ever been excited for the draft in the last 5 to 10 years? Like, serious, honest question. If you are excited for the draft, and I'm answering my own question because I am excited, but I know what to expect, though. These people, like, being excited or expecting massive change, yeah, the company, I know someone had responded to me and says, oh, it's because the company says it's going to be groundbreaking. Is it ever groundbreaking? No, it never fucking is. The draft has never been groundbreaking aside from maybe the first one 20 years ago. That is it. Nothing ever really dramatically changes in the draft. Every single year. So anyone expecting otherwise is an idiot. Honestly, I mean, if you just expect otherwise, I mean, we even talked about it last week. Is it going to be a moving around of the furniture type of thing? That's exactly what it is. Every single year. John Ritland, you get it. You ask the question. You know what to expect. You probably thought it was a shit show too, and I understand that. But anyone thinking it would be more than what it was is fooling themselves or just doesn't watch the product. Or just has short-term memory loss or just doesn't remember shows that happened a year ago, because we go through this every fucking year. I answer this every fucking year. Anyway, Chris W. from YouTube, their first question was, he says, hi, Graham, hope you're doing tremendous and having a great week. What do you consider to be the worst or most boring match you have ever seen live? I mean, I've been to hundreds of wrestling shows, so it's hard to say what, like, the worst match is. I mean, I've seen a lot of bad matches that I probably can't even remember. I can tell you that one of the worst major shows that I've been to was Mania or Hell in the Cell 2016. RJ will tell you the same thing. That was it had some good matches on it, but it was largely a waste of fucking time. Not a great show. The worst match I have probably ever seen, and he might want me to say Charlotte and Sasha from Hell in the Cell 2016. It was not a great match, but that was not the worst match I've ever seen. It has got to be one of them anyway. Toward the top of my head, Randy Orton and Bray Wyatt from WrestleMania 33. That was a fucking embarrassment. And I like those guys, but the storyline was good too. The execution sucked. They did like the spooky nonsense. The rematch at Mania 37 was also pretty bad, but the 33 one was even worse because it was for the WWE Championship. That sucked. I've seen a lot of bad matches. I can't go through every show I've ever been to and say, oh, that was the worst. Because they've been to a lot of Manias in the past number of years as well, so Taker and Roman was also pretty bad on that same show, actually. I mean, that was different at the time because, like, Taker seemingly retired, so it was okay. The Orton and Wyatt thing was just stupid, and Orton winning was also a waste. So that's probably the number one pick, but I'm sure there's others. I'm sure there's plenty more, trust me. Next question of his. I look at the NXT roster, and unfortunately, I only really see a roster of mostly fantastic athletes, but not very good or believable characters. Yes, Ilya had a good character, Trick Williams is a good character, and so is, in my humble opinion, the women putting on the best character work in the brand right now, Tatum Paxley. But when you really look at the roster, there are not a lot of enjoyable or believable characters to invest our emotions into. Tony D'Angelo flip-flops so much between heel and face that it's impossible to figure out how to feel towards them. Characters just do random crappy vignettes or segments backstage, or some try to play characters and gimmicks, but fail to bring any believability to the part, like Roxanne Perez as a heel, he says. My question is, do you think NXT struggles with creating good or consistent characters, especially since it's considered the developmental brand? I mean, that's exactly it. I kind of give them some slack. I'm not defending them entirely because they have done a lot of dumb shit on that show in the last couple of years as far as some of the vignettes and characters and storylines. But yeah, it's developmental. They're trying new shit. Some stuff will stick, a lot of stuff will not. So they do struggle with that. But my bigger concern about NXT right now anyway is how they're going to replenish the roster. Because again, they lost a lot more people in the draft. And they just debuted 2 new guys on NXT last night who immediately lost to the OC. Not exactly a riveting debut. They brought in Javon Evans. He's great. He was doing Level Up stuff on NXT Level Up prior to being brought up to NXT TV. But they need more names than that. They lost a lot more female and male talent. And a lot of them are experienced too, like people like the cornerstones of the show, like the Ilyas and the Carmelos and the Blairs and people like that, Lyra. Those are not like NXT 2.0 stars. They are, or were, but they didn't come up inexperienced. All of them had experience prior to going to the main roster. Like, we've had a lot of, like Braun Breaker's an NXT 2.0 project, and he was obviously a success. But, like, they need to kind of flesh out the Tony D'Angelos, and even he's more so, main roster ready than a majority of that roster. Like, I look at that women's division, they have a lot of talent there, and even the men's as well. There's not a lot of compelling characters, you are right. And that's something they need to work on. They haven't always, they've struggled with that, but that's not really a new thing. The new issue they have is filling in the vacancies that people like Ilya and Carmelo leave behind. That's a lot of talent to lose in one fell swoop. So how they plan to kind of fill those spots is what I'm kind of most curious about personally. Your next question, after watching those two dull as dishwater draft shows, is what you said, I feel the draft has become a gag running at this point that's been beaten to the ground like a dead horse. My biggest problem is that despite them hyping up the shows like they're going to shake the foundation of the WWE, very little changes were made and very few switches to different shows were done. Again, that's just not true. That's just not true. We talked about this before. That's just not true, Chris. But anyway, he said, despite some logical picks and the Raw side getting a boost in women's talent. Every year I ask what the point of this is. One, if barely anyone is going to change shows. Again, also not true. And two, even if the draftees are on one show, there's no guarantee they will not remain on that show and instead appear in the blue brand when they are on Raw and Raw when they are inclusive to SmackDown. Do you think they should at least try to make the draft somewhat interesting or worth investing in, or are people getting their hopes up over something the company will never change? I think they've improved it, and they should continue to improve it. I'm not completely, I think they could get rid of the draft and alter it if they know there's enough negative fan feedback, because they pay attention to that stuff on social media. So, yeah, that's part of it. People get their hopes up for something that they have not changed dramatically in recent years. So I'm not really sure why people expect otherwise. Why invest in it if it's the same shit every single year, like you said? But at the same time, you're not wrong. Like, as far as people not switching shows, that's just vehemently not true, like we just said a second ago. Like, 30 people change shows. That's a fair amount of people. What, is everyone going to switch shows? Like, it may not have been at the top of the card, but the people that stayed put at the top of the card should have stayed where they are anyway. But anyway, as far as, like, staying more true to the brand split, that's true. Like, they should do a better job of that. They really don't. A lot of people show up on Raw and SmackDown anyway. They don't really switch shows necessarily, but they do appear on the other brand even though they belong to the other show, if that makes sense. So instead of staying true to their one home, they show up on the other brand because for whatever fucking reason. They need to do a better job with that. I've given pretty much up on that because they've been doing that for 2 decades now. That will never probably change. They'll never do a hard brand split probably again. They might say they do, but they don't. They never really stick to it. It goes away within weeks of the draft happening. There's stuff they can improve upon, and I don't have complete loss of faith where they can't improve upon it even further in the future, because they have so far in recent years. We've come a long way from the Superstar Shakeup days where that shit just didn't make sense at all. Next question. What has been your favorite episode of Dark Side of the Ring so far this season? I still can't forget what the hell I saw with the Buff Bagwell episode, he says. I walked away from the Brutus Beefcake episode very much liking Brutus as a person. I like how Harley Race's episode shows how truly tough he was, but also how dangerous living his lifestyle can be, and he was also a piece of shit, apparently, that beat his wife. I did not know that before watching that episode. And then he continues, and the episode last week made me respect Sherry Martel's work even more as a fan. What would be your favorite episode or episodes? It's been a solid season. My favorite episode, the Buff Bagwell one was crazy. That one was nuts. Maybe that one was interesting. The Sherry Martel one was good. The Chris Colt one was crazy. The Chris Adams one was nuts. I liked the Earthquake one. He seems like a good dude. It wasn't like a great must-see episode, but that was certainly an interesting one. I didn't really know a lot about him before watching that, so I thought that was a good episode. I'm pulling up my reviews because I'm trying to see what we've seen. I haven't watched the one from last night yet. I haven't seen that one. The Harley Race one was interesting. Honestly, my favorite one so far this season might be the Terry Gordy one. That one I thought was really fascinating. I knew nothing about the guy aside from the fact that he was a free bird, and I thought that one was really, really interesting. That one and the Buff Bagwell one were probably... That one was the craziest. The most interesting might have been, for me, the Terry Gordy one. But the whole season so far has been good. And I'll catch up on the Sandman one a little bit later on in the week. Probably today, actually. And review it for the weekend. Next question from Greg L. from Facebook. What do you think could be AEW's saving grace? I mean, I don't know if there's a saving grace. It's not like the company's dying. It could be doing better. They're struggling, but they're not dying. That's kind of what it makes it sound like when you say saving grace. But I'll just say this, as a general rule of thumb, they could be doing a better job with storylines and creating more characters that I give a fuck about, as opposed to, oh, great match, great match, great match. Yeah, sure, they have a lot of great matches. I can get great matches anywhere. Maybe better there than most places, but like, they need more storylines that it's worth tuning into, like long-term stuff, short-term stuff. I feel like the pay-per-views knock it out of the park, but the weekly television shows are just not all that interesting. They do not feel remotely as must-see as they did even a few years ago. So they need to do a better job with that. No L from Facebook. What did you think of this year's WWE draft? Already answered it, but I enjoyed it overall, but I get the criticisms. I talked about that earlier. Their second question was, do you see Tiffany Stratton becoming the WWE Women's Champion before or after SummerSlam? I'm going to say before, because here's the thing. I feel like she's the perfect person to beat Bayley for that belt. Her beating Bayley anytime soon would be premature, because Bayley just won the championship at WrestleMania. But if it's not Tiffany, then who on that brand could beat Bayley for the belt? That's a lot of B's. I don't think it would be Candice or Indy. They might be filler challengers, but I don't think they beat Bayley. I don't think it would be Jade. She's currently a babyface. Bianca, no. We've had enough Bayley and Bianca matches to last a lifetime, so no. Charlotte is still a ways away, and I don't want Charlotte beating Bayley anyway. Been there, done that. No thanks. They have other talent, obviously, on that show. Naomi, no. It would probably have to be Tiffany, I think. So if they're doing the triple threat on Saturday, I don't think Tiffany wins there. I wouldn't complain, but it would be too quick for Bayley to use it that quickly. Use it or lose it. I mean, lose it. Maybe at the following pay-per-view, Queen of the Ring, or maybe she wins Money in the Bank. I could see her winning before SummerSlam, if not at SummerSlam. So I'll say before or at SummerSlam, Tiffany wins it. Because if not her, I'm not really sure who else it would be. Christopher L. from Facebook. Cameron Grimes being released, while it was kind of obvious they didn't really do anything with him on the main roster, was still quite shocking given that he was a guy Triple H liked in NXT. It sucks because if he had carried that character he played during the feud of the LA Knight, he would have gone over big, especially the whole "to the moon" catchphrase. Do you think once he hit the main roster, creative dropped the ball with him immediately? And what does it say about it being a Triple H guy in the new regime that even if you are one, it doesn't protect you as much? So there's a lot to say about Cameron Grimes. I didn't really go into detail about it on WrestleRant Radio last week. He was just, he even talked with us on Busted Open Radio. It is ultimately Triple H's fault that he got fired because he makes the calls. And he runs the company, and, Nick Khan does too, but if Triple H really wanted to use him, then, he would have used him by now. He's been in charge on his own now for a few months, if not longer than that, where he could have used him if he wanted to. He really didn't. So, his bed was made, or whatever the fucking expression is. He was pretty much cooked by that point. But he came in at a point where Vince was also meddling in creative, so that didn't really fare too well for him last spring rather. Triple H also did drop the ball with him. You are right, no one is truly safe. Whether you're a Triple H guy or girl or not, you are not safe in the new regime. No one is safe. No one is ever really safe from anything. Unless you're like a Roman Reigns or a Rollins or someone that's kind of almost untouchable. Beyond a few select people, almost everyone on that roster is expendable, including Cameron Grimes. But they should have fleshed out his character more. The problem with the NXT stuff, and I love NXT, but is that not everyone watches NXT. So you can't just expect him to be called up and then his entire character arc takes place in NXT. Like, some people don't really have an arc, they just come in and they're amazing. Grimes, he got over because of his character arc. If you didn't watch that character arc, you probably don't give a fuck about him on the main roster. And they never gave him a different character arc or didn't copy that arc on the main roster, so he never really stood a chance. He never got over, was never really used, and then he was fired. So it is ultimately Triple H's fault, but had he been called up now when Vince was not there at all, he might have fared a little bit better. But I don't know how much better, because they have a really stacked roster right now. They didn't even try with him. They didn't even really fucking try. So it's not like they tried and he didn't get over. They didn't even really try at all. That's kind of the problem. So he might have fared a little bit better had he been called up this year. By last year, he was overdue for a call-up. He's been with WWE now for 5+ years. He needed the fucking call-up in 2023, if not sooner. But let's just say it worked out differently. I feel like he would have fared a little bit better, but how much better, I don't know. His next question, what storylines in pro wrestling made you embarrassed to be a fan of the sport? I mean, storylines? I don't know about any storylines. I'll tell you this. The Claire Lynch angle in TNA was fucking atrocious. Like, that was when TNA was thriving, too. In, like, mid-2012, they were doing the live shows, and they had a great roster. But they were still doing, as for some of the best television they were also doing some of the worst. That Claire Lynch shit was awful. It was awful. At the same time, though, there's not a lot of storylines. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of storylines, but that I'm thinking were really that embarrassing. The whole Vince McMahon thing, illegitimate son, that was actually not the storyline itself, but I turned into my first Raw when that happened. I think for the first time. And it wasn't riveting enough to make me tune in every week. Let's just put it that way. That exactly wasn't, if I was watching full time at that point, I would not have been all that proud to be a fan. Beyond that one, I mean, there wasn't, again, no storylines that come to mind. I mean, there's been a lot of dumb ones, like the Sheamus and Jeff stuff when he was like, oh, piss in this bottle. I mean, that was pretty bad. There's been a lot of bad ones. I mean, really just the product itself, especially was embarrassing to follow in the early 2010s. I didn't really see it that way because I was a fan no matter what. But I wouldn't have wanted to watch the product with other people that were not fans. I would be embarrassed. Like, even my mom, when I was a kid, would walk in when I was watching, and she would be like, what the fuck is this shit? I mean, she wouldn't really like it anyway, but especially more so back then when the product was really bad and they were doing some of the dumbest shit you could possibly imagine. It was definitely extra embarrassing in, like, 2009, 2010, 2020, 11, 2012. I enjoyed some of those periods, but a lot of it was very bad and embarrassing. Their next question, what went wrong with DIY on the main roster? They were huge stars in NXT as a tag team and as rivals on both opposite sides of the spectrum, heel versus face. But once they hit the main roster, it seems both men have struggled to get over as competition or as competitors and as characters on TV. What do you think began their troubles, and how do you think they will finally become the stars that they were destined to be in developmental? Inconsistency, I think, is part of it. I think if they came up... So here's the thing. They had an amazing run in NXT, and then they kind of lost that momentum, is the issue. If they were called up at the peak of their popularity in NXT, and Vince was not running creative, then they could have done like a really, really good job, I think, with him or them rather on the main roster. Like Gargano and Ciampa, if they were called up in 2018, maybe 2019, and Triple H was in charge, and they honestly probably would have gone up. I know for a fact, they might say otherwise, they were not going up because Vince was in charge, and they knew it would have been a fucking disaster. An absolute fucking disaster. I mean, Johnny would have rather left the company. I know he just had a kid. Again, you can spin it any way you want. Part of it was the fact that Vince was in charge. He knew he would get fired if he stayed with that company in 2021 or whatever it was. He came back in 2022 when Triple H was in charge. Just inconsistency. I mean, he's had a lot of injuries. Ciampa's had a lot of injuries. That has a lot to do with it. They haven't really had a character arc on the main roster. Also part of the problem. There hasn't really been a lot to get excited about there. They need to be let loose on the main roster in the ring. I mean, they have been to a certain extent as far as their matches go, but they just need that consistent character arc they had in NXT. They have not gotten that yet on the main roster. And whenever they have, they've either gotten hurt or they got called up at the wrong time. I mean, Ciampa got called up in 2022. Vince was in charge. They weren't doing shit with him. He was paired with Miz. No one gave a shit. He was just a lackey for the Miz. No one gave a fuck about Ciampa. You know, I mean, it was just poor timing. So between the changes in regimes, the inconsistency was with them. I mean, I think they would have really gotten cooking after Mania last year, or at least Gargano did, but then Vince was still there. So that was also part of the problem. And they didn't form DIY until after Vince went away. So that was also part of the problem too. They need to really, and if they're going to get over, they need to like be pushed consistently and not as just a regular team, and also cut more promos and do more character stuff. That's the key. I think that they're not cooked. They're not like damaged goods or dead in the water, but they really need to do a better job of them creatively and hopefully getting a run as tag team champions before they call it quits as partners. Ideally, it's SummerSlam in Gargano's native Cleveland. I feel like that would make the most sense. Their next question, Stardom star Julia has signed with NXT, which was indicated to take over Philadelphia during WrestleMania weekend. However, a couple of weeks ago, I read an article in which it stated Julia's first match will be in July or on one of the weekly TVs, and that it will be a match for the North American Women's Championship. For starters, I think it would be a stupid idea to have her debut on a random episode of NXT and instead have her debut at the Great American Bash pay-per-view to make the occasion feel special since she is being perceived as a big deal. I also think her competing for a title on her debut gives off Hulk Hogan WCW vibes, with the key exception being only that hardcore fans know who she is. Do you think I make fair criticisms? And how would you debut Julia in NXT? I would not. I saw that same report from Fightful. I would also not have her go for the championship immediately. I mean, that immediately negates the inaugural champion, because Julia should not lose in her debut. So if she debuts for a fucking title, the inaugural champion, which is being crowned in June after announcing the championship in April, is going to hold it for a fucking month. And at that point, what's the point? At that point, just hold off until July and crown her the inaugural champion. If that was the case, I would have been more fine with that. I think it's stupider. Because like even Ricochet and Ricochet and EC3 went for the North American Championship in their debut. They didn't win it. If they did, it would have been fine. But, I'm okay if she were to win it as the inaugural champion. Because like she's coming in and the belt was kind of made for her. I understand that. But to have someone else win it and then her win it off of them within a month, that's like Hulk Hogan nonsense. That's just fucking stupid. So I would have her, maybe have a little mini feud first and rack up some wins and then go for the championship in the second half of the year, then rush into it. It's simple as that. Just do that, get people accustomed to her. And I agree, save her debut match or debut appearance or whatever for that Heatwave show in Canada, as opposed to doing, you said Great American Bash. I don't think they're doing that because they're going to be in Canada. So how can you have the Great American Bash in Canada? That just doesn't make sense, obviously. Heatwave would be the proper place to have her debut, which I think is the plan anyway, and not go for the championship unless that's the inaugural championship match, which it's not. We found out last night it's going to be a battleground. So it seems like that will be the match to do. Would be Julia, or the way to go rather, with her having a match at Heatwave as opposed to immediately going for the championship. Noob_N_Code TV. Their first question was, your thoughts on this year's draft. We already talked about the draft. I've spent a lot of time talking about the draft, but your main question was, which NXT call-up surprised me the most? He said Ilya Dragunov was his. I don't know how you could be surprised by that. I mean, he just lost the NXT Championship. It was pretty clear he was headed to the main roster after he appeared on Raw a couple of weeks ago. I know Roxanne Perez didn't debut on Raw, or she debuted on Raw and she didn't get drafted, but she's also the NXT Women's Champion, which they have drafted before, but she should not be drafted with the championship. That would have been stupid. Calling up Lyra instead made a little bit more sense. But anyway, as far as most surprising call-up, probably Kiana James, because of everyone that called up, she is just not ready. She's not. I mean, Blair Davenport surprised me because I wasn't expecting her. I just expected her to be like enhancement talent in NXT forever. But it's nice they called her up. Kiana James, I was not expecting at all. She hasn't been around for that long. She's not ready. She's decent in the ring. I've mentioned it before, as a character, she bores me to fucking tears, the whole business shit. I do not give a fuck about her at all, but I hope she can find success on Raw. I guess we'll find out in due time. Next question of theirs, your thoughts on Camille being somewhat signed to AEW. I don't know what you mean by somewhat, because she is signed to AEW. You said that I believe she'll get over great there, and I hope that they don't put her in a clueless role, for example, being Mercedes Moné's bodyguard. I'm interested in what she's going to do in AEW. I didn't really think about that until you said it. I think there's a very good chance, actually, now that you said it, that, not because you said it, but now that I think about it, that she could debut as a bodyguard, as like a heavy for someone else. Because she's a very tall woman, but she shouldn't be, though. You typically reserve roles like that for people that are green, are not that good. I know Wardlow was that guy, but Wardlow was green. He wasn't ready for a actual push on his own when he came in AEW 5 years ago. Camille is. Camille's not like the best women's wrestler on the roster, but she's improved a lot. She's good enough to where she shouldn't be a fucking bodyguard. If they want to introduce her as that, then maybe. It's not a terrible role. And I guess the question is also, if you don't have her do that, and you do have her debut on her own, what does she do? I don't see her getting involved in either championship picture right now, so her better route to take would probably be going to do something like that. They need to find her. Do not bring her to TV unless you have a plan for her long term. That's my thing. Don't just debut her, have her win a match or lose a match or whatever, and then she disappears for 3 months. That would be the wrong route to take. She probably would have been better off in TNA first and then going to AEW, but I guess she didn't want to waste her time. At Iwagu91 from Twitter, their first question was, who is better, Ricochet or Will Ospreay? Oh, man, I don't know. I mean, it's all subjective, but if I had to pick, probably Will Ospreay. I mean, in 2024, he feels like a more complete package than Ricochet does. He feels far more like a world champion, star, whatnot. I know Ricochet's kind of, held back a little bit by the WWE system, style, whatever, if not more than a little bit. And Ricochet's still tremendous, but Will Ospreay's better. I mean, to me, it's not even really comparable, but I guess you could say Ricochet and you're not necessarily wrong, but I'm going to go Will Ospreay by a pretty healthy margin. His second question, do you think Giovanni Vinci will bring back the gimmick he had on NXT 2.0 before rejoining Gunther and Ludwig Kaiser? What would be the point of reuniting Imperium for a third time? He already was separated from them, and they already put them back together. So clearly, if they wanted to keep that version of Imperium together, then they would have done that. I mean, I like Imperium, so I wouldn't hate that, but then what's the point of kicking him out? I mean, they didn't really kick him out, but I mean, they kind of did. They even said, oh, we're leaving him behind. And then he rejoins them. And then he rejoins them again. That's kind of stupid, so probably not. Here's another thing, too. I saw people saying, oh, hopefully this means a return to NXT. Why, though? Weren't we all, maybe not everyone, but didn't we most of us agree that the NXT shit that he was doing 2 years ago sucked? Like, Vince is a great wrestler. I mentioned that earlier, or Brandon mentioned it. Someone mentioned it. He is a great wrestler. The Giovanni Vinci, like the Italian stallion gimmick shit, sucked. Like, he's not even really that good of a talker. Like, he's an amazing wrestler, but on the mic, he's not that good. In the Tyler Breeze-esque character that he was doing 2 years ago sucked. I don't want to see that back, at least not in NXT. I guess you could have him go back to doing that, but to do what? I don't know. Just keep him on SmackDown. He just had that run in NXT for a couple months, and they realized it wasn't working, and they brought him back up. Know what I mean? So, anyway. Next question, are the Judgment Day headed towards implosion? I mean, it looks like it might be final this time. I know they've been teasing it a lot over the years, but it seems like they might actually be headed towards implosion. Maybe not exactly soon. They might want to wait until Rhea Ripley comes back or until Dominic is cleared. But yeah, it seems like they are indeed headed for that direction. Ultimately, on the sooner side, it remains to be seen. I don't know. At Reborn Again, John Ritland from the Twitter Machine and on YouTube, Real Honesty with John Ritland. Check out his content. Does great work. His first question was, so with the rumors of WWE holding more pay-per-views, or calling them, he said calling them PLEs sounds silly, which it does, but I've kind of gotten used to it at this point, so I do agree, though. He said, holding more pay-per-views outside of the U.S. in the future, what countries could you see being featured in the coming years? I am shocked. They have yet to do a pay-per-view in Japan. I know they did Beast in the East, or Beast from the East, or whatever, back in 2015. It was a fucking house show they televised for the network. I'm talking about like an actual pay-per-view. An actual pay-per-view. I don't know it's because they don't want to intrude on New Japan territory in their an AEW partner or Wrestle One or whatever. Noah, I don't know. I just am surprised they haven't done that yet, because Japan to me would make the most sense. AEW at some point will probably do a Forbidden Door over there, I would have to think. But yeah, I'm surprised WWE hasn't done one there yet. Elsewhere, I know people have pitched China, honestly, really anywhere, because I wouldn't have said, I would not have said Germany. Not because I don't like Germany, nothing against Germans, obviously, but in the sense that, I wouldn't think, oh, they should do a wrestling show there. I don't know, and then they are going to do one, and it's probably going to sell well, so as long as they're a hot crowd, that's really all I give a shit about. So Japan would be my number one. I'm trying to think where else. They're going to France. They've been to England, Germany, Australia. I was hoping they would do, and they did. Australia was cool. That was a great atmosphere. Yeah, probably Japan, though. I mean, the timing thing, the time zone, I understand that's kind of a problem, but they did Australia, so it doesn't have to be a major show. It can be like a smaller show, but I don't really think anything's off limits for the most part at this point. But probably Japan would be my number one pick. Second question of his, non-wrestling related, but after the spot on Raw, are you planning to see the Fall Guy at all? Early reviews are pretty solid, it seems. Currently, no. I'm busy this weekend, and listen, if the reviews are great enough and I hear enough good things, I say this all the time, but probably. Or there's a chance I could watch it at some point. I'll probably wait until it hits streaming but currently, no, I am not planning on seeing it. At the Average Grunt from Twitter, his first question was, what should be done to make all the secondary titles in AEW stand out from each other? Should a 10 to 15 minute time limit be added to TNT and TBS matches to make them more like TV titles? Should more rules be added to Continental matches to make it feel more like the pure title? The TV time limits I don't really like. NWA does that. I mean, there's 6 minutes. That's too short. I wouldn't do that for the AEW matches because a lot of their matches go beyond 10-15 minutes, so no. The Continental title matches, adding more rules. Personally, I fucking hate the pure rule shit. That not bothers me, but like I think it takes away from the match. A lot of those matches are just not all that exciting. So it's fine for Ring of Honor, but in AEW television, they're just fucking boring. So, no, I would not add more rules. What I would do to make the championships different from one another, get rid of them. The Continental Championship is fucking pointless. I know it's held by Okada. Get rid of it. Give him the fucking International Championship instead. The Continental title is just stupid. The International title really is a waste of a title too, but they have a big roster. They want to have 2 different mid-card belts. Fine, but the Continental one definitely is a waste. His second question, I have to pull his question up actually because he tweeted me a picture of it. It was like a long question. Let's see. I got to pull it up on Chrome here. And I didn't want to copy it down into my document because there was a lot of text. So I figured I would just read it out. All right, here it is. He said, hot or cold. The phrase, if you're not trying to be the world champion, you shouldn't be in the business, has done irrefutable damage to the perception of the mid-card, tag team, and women's championships in wrestling. It tells tag teams and women they don't actually matter, and they shouldn't even bother since they'll never be as important to the promoter or as fans or the fans as the top male champion. It also tells the fans that winning those championships don't matter unless it leads to a world title down the road soon after, whatever. Even if you want to be charitable with the reading and assume that the quote doesn't necessarily exclude tag and women's, which is exactly what I was thinking, actually. He put in parentheses, they could be considered the world championships of their respective divisions. That's exactly what I was thinking. It still buries the titles like the U.S. and Intercontinental Championships for no good reason or benefit to the business. Not everyone can be the world champion, so why dismiss and discourage wrestlers who are content with being credible contenders or mid-card champions? And even if you agree that every wrestler should have this mindset, there's no reason to tell this to the fans, as all it does is devalue countless championship matches going forward. All of this could have been avoided if they had just said everyone should aim to be a champion instead of the champion. Yeah, I mean, I think you're looking, per usual, Grunt, and I love you, looking too much into it, too deep into it. But yeah, no, you're right, though. I mean, listen, everyone has a certain role to play. Not everyone will be world champion. Akira Tozawa will not be world champion. You can't call yourself a failure because you've never been the world champion. Everyone has a part to play. I'm not really sure if you mean from a kayfabe standpoint when they say that on television that it makes stuff not matter, or if you mean that in a real life standpoint where it's like it kind of makes people look like, I mean, I think you're talking from a kayfabe standpoint. They don't really, do they say that on television a lot of the time? I don't know. But like in real life, I hear people say all the time, if you're not trying to be the world champion, then you're wasting your time. I think the key is not settling for mediocrity and not being complacent. That really is what it is. I wouldn't say, like you said, if you don't strive for the world championship, then you're a loser. Everyone in their life would want to be the world heavyweight champion. Not everyone is going to be the world heavyweight champion. So being a champion at all is great. I mean, unless it's the 24/7 championship, then your career might as well be over. But any other championship, like the mid-card, tag team, women's, world, whatever, yeah, I think that's a pretty good goal to set, even if it's not the world championship, because not everyone can be the world champion in kayfabe terms or even in realistically speaking terms. So yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that just settling for, I hate to use the word settle because you should not be complacent. Like if someone were to say, I was fine with being the Intercontinental Championship because I don't know, I knew I wouldn't be the world champion. I mean, unless you tried. If you tried, then that's one thing, but I was happy with the success that I had as the mid-card champion and the values those championships have, then yeah, I mean, every championship is a stepping stone for what's next. The Intercontinental and the United States Championships, they're not a waste, but they are stepping stones. Gunther is not the Intercontinental Champion just to be the Intercontinental Champion. He's the Intercontinental Champion because he wants to be the World Champion. That just subjectively makes sense, or objectively, whatever. But that doesn't make the titles mean less. Everyone should want to be the World Champion, but that doesn't make the Intercontinental to me, or the U.S. title to me, mean less. Because those belts could at some point mean that you're on your way to bigger and better things. If R-Truth were to win the United States Championship, I know he's not going to win the World Championship, but it might make sense for that story, And that's perfectly fine. So it depends on the person, depends on the title. I don't really think it's that big of a deal, but I can see where you're coming from, though. I can understand your point. Last 3 questions from @U13A here. His first one was, we are over an hour and 10 minutes, and that's crazy, so we won't spend too long here on these questions. What do you remember about 2012 Sheamus? What do I remember about 2012 Sheamus? I mean, that he was boring as fuck. Sheamus was a good wrestler, and I like Sheamus, but, I mean, there was a reason why he got booed a lot of the time, because he just wasn't interesting. He was just, the top of the guy at the top of the roster for no real reason. He was a hard worker, great, nice guy, obviously, in real life, which I didn't really know at the time. I only know that now from seeing him in interviews and interacting with him, meeting him, whatever. But, at the time, he was just another guy in the roster, and he was one of those guys in the early 2010s in WWE where people have talked about this. Everyone was the same. There was no real depth in characters in the late 2010s or early 2010s, late 2000s in WWE. You could, every single character, you could plug and place these people in their spots. And they did that for a reason, because they didn't want anyone to really feel special. I don't know if that was a conscious effort, but they didn't really put in the effort into fleshing out these characters. Sheamus was, some people are just themselves. John Cena is John Cena. Sheamus is Sheamus, but Sheamus was just not fucking interesting. He was over. It's not like he wasn't over. There's a lot of people from that time period that were not over. Jack Swagger was not fucking over. Sheamus was over, but he just wasn't interesting. He was a cookie-cutter babyface. They put the belt on because he was good enough. He was a fresher face. It wasn't like the same guard from 2005, but they also really didn't do a lot to make him more interesting. He's also been a far better heel than he is a babyface, and he wasn't... I mean, he was a heel for a while, but they turned him babyface in 2011, and he worked, and it worked, but they didn't really do a lot to get you invested in the character. They didn't really do a lot of storylines with him. I think the only storyline they did with him in 2012... that was a storyline, I guess you could say, was when he got fined for kicking David Otunga, the lawyer. That's it. Other than that, he, would win a lot of his matches, and that was another thing. He was just completely dominant, and people didn't like that. So, I remember that. He almost never really lost in 2012, and people didn't like that because it was boring, which I agree with. Do you prefer the old WWE draft the lottery style or the current draft style? He asks. I preferred the battling for draft picks because I thought it was more exciting. Does it make any sense? No, it doesn't. So the current draft style I prefer, even though it's not as interesting or as exciting, but it does make more sense. They still need to tweak, as I mentioned earlier, they still need to tweak the concept to make it make more sense and make it more interesting, or just to make it its own standalone event, and not doing it the way they do on Raw and SmackDown and dragging it out over 2 or 3 hours when people really don't give a shit who ends up on Raw and who ends up on SmackDown. I care about that shit as a fucking hardcore nerd for this shit. But the average fan, why would they give a fuck who ends up on Raw and who ends up on SmackDown? Why would they give a shit? They don't care. There's no real... I mean, there's kind of a rivalry between the brands now, a little bit, but not remotely as much as there was back in 02 or 03 or 04 or 05. Or 05, excuse me. So, I grew up on the original style from 08, 09, 2010, 2011. I like those draft shows more, but... the current draft style, I would probably, if I had to pick which one I would do, it would be that one, because it makes more sense. The other draft picks with the fucking battling for draft picks is just completely stupid. There was no rhyme or reason to most of it. They just did not care. They were just doing shit back then. Last question, will Jack Perry be AEW champion? If you're asking me should he be, or you're asking me will he be, I'm going to say no. Do I think he could be? Maybe. Do I think he's ready to be? No. Do I think they will definitely put the belt on him? I'm going to say no. I just feel like between Swerve, Ospreay, and then a whole fucking bunch of other people, and so far, I mean, there really hasn't been, like in AEW, there has not been a person or a reign. I mean, some of the reigns have been just very brief, obviously. But Tony Khan has not gotten to his Jinder phase or his Jack Swagger phase, where he's just putting the belt on people just for the fuck of it. And Jack Perry's not bad. He's not Swagger or Mahal bad. But like, he's just not ready for that spot. Everyone that has held the championship was ready for that spot. Whether it be Jericho, Moxley, Omega, Page, Punk, back to Moxley, back to Page, back to Moxley. MJF was ready for this spot. Joe was ready for this spot. And Swerve was obviously ready for the spot. No one has held it that was like random or came out of nowhere. Perry, I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense, but prior to this whole angle, he was just a mid-card, lower-level guy competing for the fucking FTW championship. He lost the fucking FTW title the last time we saw him in his last match. He is not a threat to the main roster or to the main title. Do not make him a threat to the main title. I say that, and they might make him the number one contender tonight to the AEW World Championship, a double or nothing. It's way too soon, but if they do that, he better not fucking win. Because he's just not world champion material. I don't know if he ever will be, but certainly right now he is not. He is more so now world champion material than he was a couple years ago, but he's still not world champion material, especially over people like Ospreay or other people on that roster that deserve a run with it before he does. And that's going to do it, guys, for today's edition of #AskGSM, episode 544 for May 1st, 2024. Thank you guys, as always, for checking out the show. I appreciate it. If you want to send in a question to the show, you can do so by tweeting me on the Twitter machine at WrestleRant with the #AskGSM. Find me on Facebook.com/Graham.gsm.Matthews. Drop a comment on the post I usually put up on Tuesday nights, if not on the wall itself. And last but certainly not least, drop your question down below in the comment section on this very video. I'll include your question in next week's edition. Have an awesome one, guys. We got an interview dropping here on the channel at some point between now and Saturday, so keep an eye out for that. We have a lot of interviews dropping a lot of the time, but this one's a notable one. Not like John Cena or something, but a name you know, a good name. It had a backlash. It is someone on that card, I'll put it that way. You'll see that interview dropping here on the channel probably before then, on Saturday afternoon. So maybe tomorrow or on Friday it should drop. And obviously all the other original daily content here on the channel that you should be checking out, and I appreciate the support as always. Have a great one, folks. I'm Graham GSM Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.